The man went down in the alley behind the laundromat after the whole block had already turned off its lights, and the first thing Maeve Donnelly saw in the spill of light from the back door was not his face. It was the rainwater pooling under his ribs, changing color. She knelt, pressed 2 fingers to his throat, and counted a pulse so fast it could only mean one thing. She knew exactly who she was looking at. Everyone in Cutler's Point knew that black car, that name, and the unwritten law that says a wise person turns around. She called for help. The dispatcher told her the bridge was flooded. The storm hadn't broken, and the nearest ambulance couldn't get across before daylight. Then the man's hand came up and closed around her wrist, not hard, but hard enough for her to understand what that hand was accustomed to doing, and through clenched teeth he told her, no hospital, no police, because if she made that call, what came up this alley would not be an ambulance. After that, he couldn't speak at all. Maeve Donnelly dragged the laundry cart out into the alley, got him into it, and hauled him up 3 flights of stairs in the dark. On the landing, she knocked on 4 doors asking for a bag of ice, just one bag, and all 4 doors opened exactly one narrow strip of light. Saw her, saw him, and closed back down to nothing. Inside her own apartment, under a desk lamp wrapped in a bath towel, she opened the case of instruments she had never once found the courage to throw away, and she understood precisely what she was about to do. They had taken her license in front of television cameras, and if she picked up that needle, she would lose any chance of ever getting it back. She picked it up. When the night passed through its deepest hour, the fever pulled him halfway out of unconsciousness, and the man whose name nobody in that city said out loud began speaking in fragments to people who were not in the room. Then he called out a name, twice, the way a man calls across water. And the woman the whole block called, the nurse who killed a patient, leaned close to his ear and answered that name with a single sentence, though she had no idea who it belonged to. Out there in the storm, 9 men who owed him their lives let their phones ring unanswered that night, and it would be a long time before anyone understood what that actually meant. Before the sky went gray, the fever would break, and the man on that couch would spend the rest of his life proving he never forgot who opened a door for him. But this night is only the middle of the story. To understand why a single mother would haul the most dangerous man in the city up 3 flights of stairs and into her own home, you have to go back 3 years, to 2 rooms in the same city, one with cameras in it, one with no windows at all, where 2 people who had never met lost, at the very same hour, the thing they would spend the rest of their lives trying to get back. If you love stories about people the world priced wrong, leave a like, drop a comment, share this with whoever came to mind just now, and subscribe to our channel to walk this road all the way to the end. 3 years earlier, on a late autumn morning when the sunlight still lay pale across the rows of wooden chairs, 2 rooms in the city of Providence were opening at the same time, and no one inside either room knew the other one existed. The first was on the 4th floor of St. Bridget Hospital, with dark wood-paneled walls, 3 cameras mounted on tripods, and a row of harsh white lights so bright they seemed to flatten every face beneath them. Maeve Donnelly sat alone at the head of the long table, wearing the only gray coat she owned, both hands resting open on the tabletop, with the practiced habit of someone accustomed to keeping her hands clean before entering an operating room. Across from her sat 9 members of the board, and not one of them looked directly at her for more than 2 seconds. Peter Ledford sat in the witness row, his left hand hidden beneath the edge of the table because it was trembling, and when the attorney asked him who had been responsible for monitoring the readings during that critical stretch of time, he gave exactly one answer, only one sentence, saying that he had trusted the monitoring to the nurse anesthetist. The sentence was as light as a pebble tossed onto the surface of a lake, and the entire room turned toward Maeve Donnelly as though responding to a signal. She told the truth. She said she had given 3 verbal warnings, that the number on the monitor had begun to fall before that hand ever touched the abdominal cavity, that she had asked whether they should stop, and that the answer she received was no. She spoke slowly and clearly, without adding a single adjective, exactly the way someone would read back a chart. And while she spoke, the sound of the secretary typing in the corner grew slower, then stopped altogether. That was the detail she remembered forever. Not the lights, not the cameras, but the moment when the only sound still recording her words also went silent, and she understood that nothing she was saying was going anywhere. Then Constance Ledford, seated in the 3rd chair from the left, the woman who had funded the operating wing downstairs that bore her family's name, leaned slightly toward the microphone. She didn't raise her voice. She had never needed to. She said that this hospital had endured through generations because everyone understood their place, that some hands were trained to hold a scalpel, and some hands were trained to clean up afterward, and that tragedy only came when someone confused one kind of hand for the other. Her voice was soft and contained, like the sound of a door being closed by someone who had spent a lifetime closing doors. No one objected. No one coughed. The secretary began typing again. When the hearing ended, the row of white lights went dark, one by one, from left to right, and for the few seconds before the ceiling lights came on, the room sank into a suspended gray light that Maeve would continue seeing in her sleep for years. She stood, fastened the button of her coat again, and walked out into the hallway. There, sitting on a plastic chair beside the window, was an older woman dressed in black, holding a handbag in her lap. She looked up as Maeve passed. She said nothing. Maeve said nothing either. The two women looked at each other for exactly 1 moment, then looked away, and many years would pass before they spoke their first words to one another. That same morning, 4 miles to the south, beneath the old harbor district of Cutler's Point, the second room didn't have a single window. It had once been a cold storage room, with tarnished steel walls, a low ceiling, and a long metal table in the center that had been carried down there in the generation before. 15 men sat around that table, and every one of them was accustomed to being listened to. At the head of the table, Rafe Belandi sat with his hands resting loosely before him, his black wool coat still draped over his shoulders, and he said nothing. One man spoke first, talking about shipping routes, about accounts that weren't clear, about who would step forward now that the old man was gone. Rafe didn't answer. A second man spoke, longer this time, and his voice rose with every sentence, the way a man's voice often rises when he's trying to fill a silence that was never his to fill. Rafe still didn't answer. He only looked down at the steel tabletop, patient as a man waiting for water to boil, and with every minute that passed, his silence grew a little heavier until it seemed to settle on the shoulders of every man in the room. The third man started to speak, then stopped. The fourth loosened his collar. No one struck the table. No one stood up. Not a single threat was spoken. And by the time those 15 men pushed back their chairs and rose one after another, control of the entire old harbor had changed hands, cleanly and silently, like a sheet of paper being turned to the next page. On the way out, Otis Brannock walked beside him, carrying the day's papers in one hand, and he handed Rafe a thick ivory envelope with the hospital's name printed in one corner. Rafe took it, walked straight to his office, and slipped it into the drawer of his desk. Then he locked the drawer as he did every day. Those 2 rooms closed less than 2 hours apart in the same city. In the room with the cameras, a woman had just lost everything she had built through 10 years of work. In the windowless room, a man had just gained everything a man could possibly gain. And what neither of them could have imagined, not even much later, was that they had both just lost the same thing, though it would be a very long time before either of them learned what to call it. 3 years later, what remained of all of it was a laundromat on the ground floor of No. 7 Cutler Street, its glass storefront fogged with steam year-round, with 12 washing machines and 6 dryers, 2 of which had been broken for so long that someone with remarkably beautiful handwriting had taped signs to them saying "Don't use." The place had its own smell in the afternoons, the scent of cheap detergent mixed with hot steam, and the last trace of sunlight lingering in dry fabric, and at the hour when the sun slanted through the window and cast a long golden stripe across the tile floor, Toby Donnelly, 6 years old, would often fall asleep behind the counter on a stack of towels fresh from the dryer. His small glasses with blue plastic frames folded neatly beside his cheek, exactly the way his mother had taught him. He slept there because the towels were warm, and because they smelled of sunlight. And always, when the light began to withdraw from the window, Delphine Wexler, the owner of the laundromat, would come downstairs, put a sweater around his shoulders, lead him up to the apartment above, and feed him dinner before Maeve's night shift began. That was the arrangement between the 2 women, with no paperwork and nothing ever spoken aloud, and it had gone on with quiet regularity through season after season. On the refrigerator door, in the 3rd-floor apartment, was a bill held in place by a lemon-shaped magnet, an eyeglass adjustment bill that said the boy's eyesight was changing quickly and needed to be checked twice a year, and it also carried the figure Maeve Donnelly had to divide into weekly amounts in her head every time she stood in front of the refrigerator. She never took it down. She left it there the way people leave a road sign at an intersection they are always forgetting. And beside the front door, close against the baseboard, sat a faded brown cloth suitcase, already packed, already locked, with one broken wheel. It had been there since the first week she moved in. Inside were 3 sets of clothes for her, 5 for her son, his birth certificate, and a copy of her revoked professional license folded into quarters. She never opened it, and she never put it away. Some people live with a packed suitcase beside the door because they believe it means they are being sensible, and it takes them many years to understand that it is really only fear that has learned how to sit still. The neighborhood called her by another name. No one said it to her face, or almost no one did, but the name went ahead of her into every store, every parent meeting, every line at the pharmacy counter. They called her the nurse who killed a patient. That was all. Short and convenient, and that convenience was exactly what kept it from ever dying. She never argued against it, not once. She had learned that the cheapest way to carry a wound was to carry it in silence, and she had learned to want very little, because wanting little was its own kind of armor. Then there were the Tuesday nights. It began sometime during one winter, and simply kept repeating itself. Every Tuesday evening, around 9 o'clock, when the street had gone quiet and the sign above the door was glowing with only half its letters, a black car would pull up to the curb and an older man would step out, his silver hair cut close, his shoulders broad, the kind of man who had probably settled things with his fists when he was young. He would carry in 2 unmarked bags of laundry, set them on the counter, then sit in the plastic chair against the wall without ever leaning back, both hands resting on his knees, like a man waiting in a clinic rather than a laundromat. His name was Otis Brannock. He paid in cash, always a little too much, and always refused the change. He addressed her as ma'am. He didn't ask questions, and neither did she. Only once, when she brought out the folded laundry, did he look at the way she had arranged the shirts and say that it had been a very long time since anyone had folded a shirt along the proper creases, and then he fell silent, as though even he were surprised that he had spoken a sentence that long. Everyone in Cutler's Point knew whose black car it was. They knew it the way people know where the potholes are in the sidewalk, which is to say, they knew without needing to say it aloud. Then came the night the breaker burned out. The wind had turned cold that evening. 2 dryers were running at the same time, and suddenly the entire laundromat went dark, leaving only the street light filtering through the fogged glass, while the sound of the machines dying away in the darkness was like someone letting out one final breath and then stopping. Maeve climbed onto a chair, opened the electrical panel, and knew enough to understand that whatever had failed lay deeper than any fuse she could replace herself. The glass door at the back opened. A tall man stepped inside without a word of greeting and simply gestured for her to get down from the chair. He took a small flashlight from the pocket of his coat, shone it into the electrical box for about half a minute, then loosened something, reconnected it, tightened 2 screws, and all the ceiling lights came back on at once as though nothing had ever happened. She opened her mouth to thank him, but he had already closed the panel, folded the flashlight away into his pocket, and walked out through the back door, and by the time she followed him a few steps, there was nothing outside but the wet street and 2 red taillights receding into the distance. The next morning, Dell asked who had fixed it. Maeve said she didn't know. It wasn't exactly a lie. She hadn't seen his face clearly, but while he stood there on the tile floor in the dark, she had seen the shape of those shoulders, and she had smelled the damp wool of the black coat, and somewhere in her mind, something had quietly fitted into place with the car that sat outside every Tuesday night. She didn't tell anyone. In this neighborhood, knowing something and saying something aloud were 2 entirely different things, and Maeve Donnelly had already paid enough for speaking up. That black car, when it left the street where the laundromat stood, would usually drive another 15 minutes toward the water, past the row of old warehouses built back when the harbor was still alive, and stop in front of warehouse number 9, the only one in the row that still had its lights on after dark. Inside, it was cold all year round, the kind of cold that belonged to a place once used to store frozen goods, and voices there rose and died away very quickly, as though the steel walls swallowed half of every word. In the middle of the empty space stood the long metal table, and at the head of it was where Rafe Belandi sat. There were 7 people in the room that morning. The matter under discussion was a missing shipment, and the man who had to explain it was named Hollis, the night shift manager at Pier Number 4. His sleeves rolled high, his voice firm and certain. Hollis said the shipment had been loaded onto the truck Friday night, that he had stood there and watched it with his own eyes, that if there had been a mistake, it had happened on the receiving end, not his. He spoke smoothly, without stumbling once, with the particular smoothness of a man who had rehearsed every word in the car on the way there. Rafe listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt even once. When Hollis finished, Rafe still said nothing, and the room began to fill with that silence everyone who had worked with him long enough knew and feared, the kind of silence that threatened no one but kept stretching and stretching, until it was no longer silence at all but something with weight, something that pressed down. Hollis added another sentence, then another. Then he began repeating what he had already said, and his voice climbed a little higher. Rafe kept his eyes on the steel tabletop. Beside his elbow sat a paper cup of coffee, untouched, long since gone cold. The cup Otis had poured for him when the meeting began, and that Rafe hadn't touched once. He reached out, placed his hand against the rim, and pushed it across the metal table toward Hollis. The coffee cup slid the entire length of the table, making one small, dry sound, then stopped directly in front of the other man. No one in the room spoke. No one moved. 3 of the 7 men sitting there had been around the docks long enough to know what that cup meant, and all 3 immediately lowered their eyes to their own hands. Hollis looked at the coffee. Then he looked at Rafe. Then something happened very slowly and very clearly. His shoulders began to tremble, an uncontrollable trembling, the kind that came from a man turning cold from the inside rather than from anything in the room. And when he spoke again, his voice was completely different, lower now, quieter, and this time it was the truth. He confessed everything in less than 2 minutes. Rafe listened to the end, nodded once, and spoke the only sentence he would say that entire morning, telling them to put the shipment back where it belonged before dark. Then he stood up. No one touched Hollis. No one raised his voice. The coffee cup was still sitting there on the table after everyone had left, and Otis was the last man out of the room. He paused for a second to look at it, then turned off the lights. That same afternoon, in the small office above the warehouse, Otis placed a set of papers in front of him concerning the waterfront block on the eastern side of Cutler's Point, a row of 3-story buildings dating back to another era, their red brick walls crumbling, their roofs leaking, more than half the plumbing ruined. The city had already issued notice. A new developer was in place, and the only thing still missing was a signature terminating all the leases so the property could be cleared before the holiday season. 40 households. Otis stood beside the desk, holding the attached list, and asked whether he wanted to see the names of each household. Rafe picked up the pen, signed, and said no. He didn't lift his eyes from the desk when he said it. Otis remained there for 1 beat longer, the beat of a man who wanted to say something more and decided against it, then folded the list closed and carried it away. Later, when people around the harbor told the story, they didn't tell it as the story of Rafe Belandi putting 40 families out on the street before the holidays, because in that line of work there was nothing remarkable about that. They told it as the story of a man who hadn't even bothered to look at who they were. And that was the part that sent a chill down people's backs. About a week later, another car pulled up in front of warehouse, number 9, a light-colored car, spotless, unlike anything that had ever parked there before. The person who stepped out was an older woman with silver hair cut neatly short, an ivory wool coat, and a single strand of pearls around her neck. She didn't have an appointment. She said she had simply stopped by because she happened to be passing through, though there was no road in the city that conveniently passed through this place. She made an offer to buy 3 blocks of property along the water at the western edge of Cutler's Point. 3 old blocks, nearly abandoned, that hadn't produced a single dollar in years. The figure she offered was well above market value, and she gave it in the soft, controlled voice of someone accustomed to delivering conclusions rather than invitations. She added that her family foundation intended to build a community center there, with a library, a clinic, and a playground for the neighborhood children, and that she believed Mr. Belandi wanted to see the harbor district improve as well. Rafe let her finish. Then he said no. She asked whether he wanted to hear the figure again. He said no. She asked whether there was any condition that would make him reconsider. He said no. And after that he said nothing more, and that familiar silence began stretching through the cold room again, until she was the one who had to stand first. She fastened the button of her coat, smiled for exactly half a second, and said she was sorry they hadn't been able to understand one another. Otis walked her out to the car. When he came back inside, Rafe was still sitting exactly where he had been, and Otis didn't ask why. In all the years he had worked beside this man, there was exactly one thing Otis Brannock had never dared to ask, and that was why those 3 rotting blocks beside the water were the only thing in the world that would never have a price. In the 3rd-floor apartment, once everything had been put in its proper place, Maeve Donnelly did the first thing anyone who had ever stood in an operating room would do first. She washed her hands. She washed them longer than necessary, with the water as hot as she could bear, scrubbing from her fingertips to well past her elbows, beneath her nails, across the backs of her hands, around her wrists, then turning them over and washing them all again. And while she washed, she didn't think about the man lying out there. She thought about the order of the steps, because order was the only thing that kept a pair of hands from trembling. She dried them with a clean towel taken from the stack fresh out of the dryer, spread another towel across the small table she had pulled close to the couch, and laid out the things she took from her kit, in a straight line, according to the exact order in which she would need them. The clamp first, the scissors after that, gauze, thread, needle, an order that lived deeper in her hands than memory itself. The light was the biggest problem. The table lamp, wrapped in cloth, cast down a dull yellow pool that was enough for someone to sleep by, but not enough for someone to work by. She looked around, and what she found was a small plastic flashlight shaped like a whale, the one Toby kept on the windowsill because he wouldn't sleep without it. She switched it on to test it. It worked, a tiny trembling beam of white light, enough to illuminate an area no larger than the palm of a hand. She held it between her teeth, adjusted the angle by tilting her head, and from that moment until much later, there were only 3 things left in the entire room: a small circle of light, 2 hands, and the rhythm of the man's breathing on the couch. She cut away the fabric, cleaned the area around where she needed to work, and began. Her left hand held steady. Her right hand worked. She didn't look at his face once. She looked only at that patch of light, no larger than her palm, and everything beyond that small circle temporarily ceased to exist. From time to time, she stopped, pressed 2 fingers to the pulse in his neck, counted, then continued. At one point, she had to clamp down and hold it there for quite a long while, long enough for the muscles in her upper arm to begin burning, and for the flashlight between her teeth to make her jaw go numb. But she didn't let go, because she knew that if she released it now, everything she had done up to that moment would be lost. Then the object came free. It was much smaller than people imagined such things to be, misshapen, dark, sitting neatly in the jaws of the clamp. She looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then she did what anyone who had spent enough time in an operating room would do without even thinking. She never threw away something that had just been taken out of a human body. On the shelf beside the sink was a row of empty medicine bottles she had saved for safety pins, buttons, and other little things. The habit of a woman who didn't have enough money to buy storage containers. She reached for one, dropped the object inside, screwed the lid on, and put it back on the outermost row of the shelf, between the jar of safety pins and the jar of buttons. She did it with the same absent-minded manner of someone putting a spoon back into a drawer, then forgot about it, and for many months afterward, she would walk past that shelf hundreds of times without thinking about it once. She returned to her work. Wash, blot, then begin stitching. Needle in, pull the thread, tie the knot, cut. Needle in, pull the thread, tie the knot, cut. She worked slowly and evenly, each stitch spaced exactly the same distance from the next, and she counted in her head, not because she needed to count, but because counting helped her keep the rhythm. The 5th stitch, the 9th. There was one difficult place where the edges of the skin wouldn't sit right, and she had to undo it and start again. And she started again, without the slightest irritation. The 13th stitch. Sweat ran down her temple, and she lifted her forearm to wipe it away without letting her hands touch her face. The 15th stitch. The flashlight in her mouth was beginning to weaken, the sickly yellow glow of dying batteries, and she moved a little faster, but not fast enough to ruin anything. The 17th stitch. Knot. Cut. Done. She let the flashlight fall from between her teeth, placed it on the towel, and straightened her back for the first time since she had begun, and only then did she realize how badly her shoulders hurt. She disinfected the outer area again, placed gauze, wrapped a pressure bandage, and raised the foot of the couch with 2 old telephone directories. She pulled the thin blanket up to his chest. Then she cleaned up, gathered everything she had used into a bag and tied it shut, wiped the table down again, washed her hands one more time, and put the kit back in its old place beneath the bed. Outside the window, the rain had eased, leaving only the steady sound of water running from the gutter into the back courtyard like a broken clock. Maeve Donnelly pulled the wooden chair close to the couch, sat down, placed both hands on her lap, and began the hardest part of all work like this, the part no one taught in school and no instrument could help with. sitting there and waiting. The first thing Rafe Belandi saw when he opened his eyes wasn't the ceiling, but a crayon drawing taped to the wall with yellowed strips of tape at all four corners. It showed a blue whale with a smiling mouth and a spout of water shooting into the sky. And beside it were 3 more drawings: a house with a chimney, a dog with only 3 legs, and a woman holding something round that took a long look to recognize as a laundry basin. He lay still and stared at them for quite a while before he understood where he was. The room smelled of laundry detergent, cold tea, and dry fabric. The light filtering through the thin curtain was the silvery gray light of a morning after a storm, the kind of light that cast no sunlit shadows, only one even color over everything. He shifted, and immediately knew he shouldn't have. Footsteps approached, slow and unhurried. The woman appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair tied back with an elastic band, her sleeves still rolled to the elbows, the dark circles beneath her eyes so deep they looked like ink stains. She didn't startle when she saw he was awake. She didn't stop in the doorway. She walked straight in, sat on the edge of the chair, placed 2 fingers against his neck, counted, then let go and gave a single nod to herself. That was all. Rafe Belandi had lived for more than 30 years in a city where people looked at him in exactly 2 ways, either lowering their eyes or raising them to wait for an order, and in that moment, he realized this woman did neither. She looked at him the way someone looked at a broken dryer, which was to say she was looking to see what condition it was in, not to find out who it was. He tried to sit up. She placed her palm on his shoulder and pressed him back down, not hard, and he lay down again. And it was the first time in many years that anyone had touched him to tell him not to do something. In a voice rough with dryness, he asked how much she wanted. She was folding the towel in her hands and didn't look up when she answered, only telling him that for now, he needed to go back to sleep. He said it again, more slowly this time, telling her to name a number. She set the towel down, looked at him, and said that if he still had enough strength to bargain, then he had enough strength to lie still, and she wanted him to lie still. Then she stood, went back into the kitchen, and he heard water running into the kettle. He lay there staring at the blue whale on the wall, and there was something in his mind that he couldn't seem to arrange into any sensible shape. Downstairs, at the foot of the stairway in number 7 Cutler Street, there was a 3-legged dog named Domino, a mixed breed with 1 torn ear, who had wandered around the neighborhood for several seasons, and allowed exactly 1 person to touch him. Since before dawn, he had been sitting on the lowest step barking. He barked without stopping, not at anything in particular, the dry, relentless bark of a dog that had decided it wouldn't stop until someone came. People in the building opened their windows and shouted down at him twice, then gave up. He kept barking. And around mid-morning, when the street had begun drying in irregular patches, an older man came walking up the block, his coat still soaked from the night before, his shoes waterlogged, his silver hair plastered to his forehead. Otis Brannick had been walking all night. He had gone past Pier number 4, past 3 warehouses, past 2 places that were still open, and he had made 9 phone calls that no one answered, and by the time the sky began to brighten, there was nowhere left for him to go, so he walked, simply walked, from one street to the next, the way a person searches for something he no longer dares believe can still be found. He heard the dog barking from the end of the street. He had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know that dog, and to know that it never barked for no reason. He stopped in the middle of the wet sidewalk, stood listening a little longer, then raised his eyes toward the row of 3rd-floor windows at number 7. Exactly 1 window still had the hallway light on, a small, weak yellow bulb that no one would have noticed in daylight. Otis Brannick stared at it for a very long time. Then he stepped past the dog, pushed open the fogged glass door of the laundromat on the ground floor, and went upstairs. No one in Cutler's Point needed the story explained, because a neighborhood doesn't need explanations. It only needs a black car parked out front in the middle of the morning, and 3 men going up to the 3rd floor, then coming back down, and that is enough. By afternoon, the story had taken on a shape of its own. By the next day, it had changed its name. People didn't tell the story of a woman dragging a dying man up 3 flights of stairs in the middle of a storm. They told the story of a man who had spent the night in the 3rd-floor apartment, and of Belandi's car having been parked outside that laundromat every Tuesday night for a long time, and of how anyone could have seen this coming. In only 2 days, she was no longer the nurse who killed a patient. She had become Belandi's woman. And the strange thing, the thing Maeve Donnelly realized while standing in line at the pharmacy and watching the 2 women ahead of her turn away, was that this new name clung even more tightly than the old one, because it needed no proof at all and gave people far more to talk about. In the large house on the hill to the north, Constance Ledford read everything she needed to read in a single afternoon. She didn't need anyone to report to her. She only needed 2 names appearing beside each other in the same story. The name of the woman who had once stood before the cameras in that hearing room, and the name of the man who had sat in silence without saying a word when she gave him a price for the 3 waterfront blocks. For years, those 2 names had occupied opposite ends of her notebook. One a matter already finished, the other a matter still unfinished. Now they were on the same line. She set down her teacup, and for the first time in a very long while, she smiled for more than half a second. The Ledford Foundation held the lease on the entire building at number 7 Cutler Street, including the laundromat on the ground floor. And no one in the neighborhood knew that, not even Delphine Wexler, until the morning she received a phone call and a lease renewal letter with a few small lines added at the bottom of the page. Del had lived 70 years in this neighborhood. She wasn't a cruel woman. She was simply afraid. She stood in the laundromat, twisting her hands together, looking down at the tile floor instead of up, and she said she was very sorry, that it was only temporary, that once things settled down they could talk again. And in the middle of the sentence, she called her Miss Donnelly. For 3 straight years, that woman had never called her anything but sweetheart. Maeve heard the word Donnelly fall from her mouth and understood immediately, before Del even finished speaking, that it was over. She didn't argue. She had learned her price once already, and she recognized the transaction. She took off her apron, folded it, placed it on the counter, and thanked her for the seasons they had had. Del didn't walk her to the door. 3 days later, a black car pulled up in front of the laundromat at an hour that wasn't Tuesday night at all, and Otis Brannick walked in carrying a thick envelope. He placed it on the counter and said it was the least they could do, that she should take it, that no one had to know. Maeve looked at the envelope for exactly 2 seconds. Then she pushed it back toward him and said she wanted him to pass along a message for her, that she wouldn't sell back a night she had chosen for herself. Otis stood there holding the envelope, and in all 63 years of his life he had heard many people refuse money, but he had never once believed them. This time, he did. He walked back out to the car, got behind the wheel, and laughed to himself, laughing all the way back to the harbor, the kind of laugh that belongs to a man who has just witnessed something he will never be able to explain to anyone. The following afternoon, Rafe Belandi came himself. No car parked outside. No one came with him. He walked there with the help of a simple wooden cane, and he stood in the middle of the empty laundromat, where no machines were running anymore, and only the afternoon light filtered through the fogged glass, while the plastic chairs sat stacked in one corner. He asked what she wanted from him. He asked it plainly, without circling around the question, the way a man asks when he has never learned how to receive anything without paying for it. Maeve was packing the last of her belongings from behind the laundromat counter into a cardboard box. She stopped, looked at him, and said she didn't want anything, that he wasn't a debt, and that if he insisted on turning himself into one, then that was his problem, not hers. The laundromat stayed silent for a long time after that. Then Rafe said he had a building on Ambler Street, 6 stories, and he needed someone to work nights and look after the lower floor, that the job came with a contract, insurance, wages paid through the bank, and clearly stated hours, and that he wasn't going to stand there and persuade her. She could think about it. He placed a business card on the counter. He added that if she didn't take the job, he still needed someone and would find somebody else, and that she didn't owe him an answer. Then he turned toward the door. Maeve looked at the business card lying on the damp counter, looked at the cardboard box at her feet, holding everything she owned, and thought of the eyeglass bill pinned to the refrigerator door with the lemon-shaped magnet. She called after him when he had already reached the door. She said she would take the job. The building on Ambler Street had 6 floors, an old elevator that ran quietly, polished terrazzo hallways, and Maeve Donnelly's job there was to watch over the lower floor, check the doors, keep the logbook, and simply be present. It was so simple that during the first week she kept waiting for some hidden condition to reveal itself. None did. Her pay arrived in her account on the proper day, with a printed pay stub showing every line clearly, and the man whose name was on the building hardly ever appeared. But other things began to appear. The first happened one morning early in the week. The faded brown cloth suitcase was still in its usual place against the baseboard beside the front door, packed, locked, and with one wheel broken since the day she had moved into that apartment. That morning, she shifted it aside to clean the floor, and it rolled. It rolled smoothly across the wooden floor on all four wheels, and she stood there watching it make a complete turn before coming to a stop. And it took her quite a while before she finally sat down, tipped the suitcase onto its side, and stared at the new wheel, black, the same size as the others, fastened with two tightly secured screws, and the excess neatly trimmed away. She asked the neighbor on the same floor. The woman didn't know. She asked the building manager. He didn't know. Maeve stood in the kitchen for a long time with the cleaning rag in her hand, and what disturbed her wasn't the thought that someone had entered her home, because she knew perfectly well that hadn't happened, but that someone had walked down the hallway, noticed a suitcase with a broken wheel sitting behind a door, and remembered it. The second thing happened at the end of the month. She took Toby to the eyeglass shop on Vandeleur Street for another examination, already calculating in her head the amount she would have to divide across 4 weeks. With the envelope of cash already prepared in the pocket of her coat, the woman behind the counter checked the records, looked up, and said that this part had already been paid in advance, both for today's visit and for the next examination as well. Maeve asked who had paid. The woman said the person had paid in cash and left no name, only told them to put it on the account of the little boy with the blue-framed glasses. Maeve stood there with the envelope still in her pocket and felt something she couldn't name. Not quite gratitude, not quite anger, but the dizzy feeling of someone who had spent 3 years knowing only what it meant to have things taken away, and who had suddenly been handed something no one was asking to have back. She didn't say anything to Rafe. He didn't say anything to her either. He never mentioned either of those things, not once, and it was precisely his silence about them that made her understand he hadn't done any of it so she would know. Then came a Saturday afternoon early in the season, when the sky had cleared and the low golden sunlight carried the warmth of winter's end, the kind of light that made every old brick wall in Cutler's Point look as though someone had just washed it clean. Behind the building on Ambler Street was a square concrete courtyard, one bench, and several potted plants belonging to the tenants on the second floor. Toby was sitting flat on the ground there with his knees drawn up, arranging small stones into the shape of a boat, while Domino stretched out in the sunlight a few steps away, lying in the absurdly comfortable posture of a 3-legged dog who had long since decided the entire place belonged to him. Rafe came into the courtyard to get something from the storage room, saw the boy, and stopped. He wasn't good at this. He had sat at the head of tables in rooms where grown men loosened their collars, but in front of a 6-year-old boy sitting on the concrete, he didn't know what to do with his hands. Toby looked up through his blue-framed glasses, studied him for a while with the intensely serious concentration children have that is almost funny to watch, then asked if he was the man who had fixed the machines at the laundromat. Rafe said yes. The boy nodded as though he had just confirmed something important. He said his mother had told him those machines had only blown a fuse. Rafe said his mother was right. Then Toby dug into the pocket of his coat and pulled out the little blue plastic flashlight, shaped like a whale, with the water spout serving as the button, and held it out. He told Rafe to take it. Rafe asked why. The boy answered in the calm voice of someone stating an obvious fact everyone ought to understand, because he would need it at night. He added that the whale stayed bright for a very long time, that it only needed new batteries sometimes, and there were more batteries at home. Then he placed the flashlight into Rafe Belandi's palm, into the hand whose knuckles had hardened with calluses long ago, and went back to arranging his stones as though the matter were settled. Rafe stood there in the sunlit courtyard, holding a plastic flashlight that weighed less than 4 ounces. In this city, there were men who had stayed awake all night because they had said one wrong word to him. There were meeting rooms where all 15 men sat in silence waiting for him to speak. And there he stood, looking at the smiling blue whale, unable to say a single word. He slipped it into the pocket of his coat. He kept it there for a very long time afterward, far longer than necessary, and he never explained to anyone why. The dinners began one rainy evening when Otis Brannock had been waiting out in the car for too long, and Maeve called down and told him to come upstairs and have something hot to drink, so he wouldn't sit there freezing. He came up. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, and she had to tell him 3 times before he finally stepped inside. Then he did something he had never done in anyone else's home in all 63 years of his life. He pulled out a chair and sat down. There are men who spend their entire lives standing in other people's doorways because they believe their place is on the threshold, not inside. Otis was that kind of man. He sat on the wooden chair with one uneven leg, placed both hands on the table, and sat very straight through the entire meal. But he sat. After that, it became a habit. 1 or 2 dinners a week, never planned, and no one called it anything. Rafe came with Otis. He spoke little while he ate slowly, and Maeve was the first person to notice the other thing. He cleaned his plate. Not that he ate a great deal, but he cleaned it completely. So completely that the plate almost didn't need rinsing. The edge scraped neatly with his fork. Not one grain of rice left behind, not one piece of bread abandoned even if it had gone cold. He did it as naturally as breathing, without any awareness that he was doing it, and that was the part that told her everything. Maeve Donnelly had stood beside enough hospital beds to know there were habits people never lost, and the habit of cleaning a plate had only one origin. She didn't ask. She would never ask, and he would never tell her. But the next time she served dinner, she gave him a little more. And the time after that, a little more again. And she did it without looking at him, neatly, as though her hand had simply slipped. Rafe noticed the second time. He said nothing. He just ate it all. And through all the seasons that followed, the two of them never exchanged a single word about it, not once. And that is how wounded people speak to each other, through what they do, with no witness but themselves. Toby wasn't complicated that way. One evening, the boy decided that the man needed to learn how to fold a napkin into a boat immediately. He spread a cloth napkin across the table, smoothed it flat with both palms, and explained each step with the grave seriousness of a master craftsman. Fold it in half, fold it diagonally, turn it over, raise the 2 points. Rafe followed his instructions. The first time, the napkin came apart into a wrinkled mess. Toby told him he hadn't smoothed it flat enough. The second time, Rafe folded it in the wrong direction, and the boat ended up upside down. Toby told him he had turned over the wrong side. The third time, Rafe got almost everything right, but at the final step, the 2 points of the boat refused to stand, and the boy sighed exactly the way grown people sigh, took the napkin from his hands, folded it again in 10 seconds, and set the little boat upright in the middle of the table. Otis Brannock turned his face away and coughed into his fist. Maeve stood at the sink with her hands still wet, and she laughed, the sound breaking free from somewhere so deep inside her that even she hadn't expected it. And in that moment, Rafe Belandi looked up at her exactly the way a person looks toward the sky at the first sound of thunder after a long season of drought. About a week later, he told her to come with him somewhere. He drove to the western edge of Cutler's Point, to the 3 old blocks beside the water, where the red brick walls were crumbling, the windows boarded over, and weeds pushed up through the cracks in the sidewalk. He stopped in front of the middle building, unlocked it with his own key, and led her up to the 2nd floor. He stopped in front of the door marked number 12. There was nothing inside. Wooden floors, peeling walls, dust thick enough that every footstep left a print, and a few slanting strips of afternoon sunlight slipping through the gaps between the boards over the windows and lying across the floor. No bed, no cabinet, no curtains. There was exactly one wooden chair in the middle of the room. Rafe didn't sit down. He stood in the center of that empty room with both hands in the pockets of his coat, and he spoke. He said he had grown up in this apartment. He said his mother had died here, on an afternoon during the cold season, and that at the time, he had been 3 blocks away collecting rent for a man whose face he couldn't even remember now. He said she had called him, and he hadn't answered, because at the time he believed what he was doing was more important. He said people had offered to buy this place many times, with numbers that kept getting higher, and he had never sold it. Not because he was preserving a memory, but because he needed somewhere to come whenever he felt himself becoming that boy again, the one who hadn't answered the phone that day. When he finished, he stopped. He added nothing else, and he stood there in the dust and the slanting light. And it was the first time in Rafe Belandi's life that he had ever explained himself to another person. Maeve said nothing during the walk back to the car. Once she was sitting in the passenger seat, she looked out through the window toward the gray water at the end of the street, and she told him that Toby often fell and scraped his knees, and that every time she changed the bandage, he demanded that she cover it again immediately, because he didn't want to look at it. Then she told him the same thing she always told her son when that happened, that a wound heals from the bottom upward, and if you sew it closed too soon, it will rot underneath. When she finished, she stopped. She didn't turn to look at him, and she didn't explain another word. Rafe Belandi drove the entire way back without speaking, and he never turned on the radio the way he usually did. The woman standing outside the 3rd-floor apartment, one late weekend afternoon, wore a black coat, worn thin at the elbows, her silver hair pinned neatly into a bun, and she held a shoebox against her chest, secured with a rubber band. Maeve Donnelly opened the door and recognized her immediately. Not because the woman had changed so little, but because Maeve had seen her exactly once in her life, sitting on a plastic chair outside the fourth-floor hallway of St. Bridget Hospital, her handbag in her lap, looking up as Maeve walked past without saying a word. Her name was Rosalind Pike. Before she even stepped inside, she said she hadn't come to forgive her, so Maeve shouldn't misunderstand, and that if Maeve wanted to close the door, she wouldn't blame her. Maeve opened the door wider. The two women sat at the kitchen table with the shoebox between them. Mrs. Pike slipped off the rubber band, lifted the lid, and inside were letters arranged upright, the edges of the envelopes facing upward, every one of them addressed to Maeve Donnelly in blue ink, and not a single one had a stamp. She said she had written one every month since the month her husband died, that some she had written in anger, some at 3 o'clock in the morning, and some contained only a single line. She said she had never put a stamp on any of them because every month she thought that by the next month she would understand something more. 36 letters. 3 years. Then she placed both hands on the lid of the box and said she had come there to ask only one question. Just one. The question that for 3 years, not one person in that hospital had been willing to answer for her, not a doctor, not a lawyer, not any board. She asked whether her husband had been in pain. The kitchen remained silent for a very long time. Maeve Donnelly looked down at her hands resting on the tabletop, and then she told her. She told the story for the first time in 3 years, and she told it to exactly one person in the world. She said he hadn't been in pain, that the medication had been given properly and in the right amount, that he had been asleep before everything began and had never woken again. Then she continued, slowly and clearly, saying that wasn't where the mistake had been. She said that when the number on the monitor began to fall, she had given the first verbal warning, and no one answered. She gave the second warning, louder, and the person standing in that position said the number was caused by the machine. She gave the third warning, and she asked directly whether they should stop, and the answer she received was no. She said that hand had been trembling, that everyone in the room had seen it trembling, and that she had been standing less than an arm's length away, with no authority to touch it. She said she had recorded all 3 warnings on the form, at the exact times, in the exact order, and those 3 lines were the only thing she had, and those 3 lines had never been read aloud in the room with the cameras. Then she said the last thing, that she was sorry, not sorry in the way people usually say the word, but sorry that for 3 years Mrs. Pike hadn't been allowed to hear any of this from anyone. Rosalind Pike sat still. She didn't cry aloud. She only lifted one hand to cover her mouth, and her shoulders trembled very slightly, and she remained that way for a long time. Then she pushed the shoebox across the table toward Maeve and said she didn't want to keep it anymore. That same afternoon, on the north side of the city, in a sitting room with tall windows overlooking a garden, Rafe Belandi sat across from Constance Ledford with a cup of tea in front of him that he never touched. She had invited him, the invitation handwritten and delivered directly to his office, and he had come, and both of them understood that this wasn't a meeting about tea. She spoke about the coming holiday season. She spoke about the harbor, about how the city was changing, about how some people knew when to stop and some didn't. She said her old offer for the 3 waterfront blocks still stood, that she was a patient woman, and that patience was a luxury not everyone possessed. Rafe told her she should keep that patience. It suited her. She smiled for exactly half a second. She said she was very sorry about what had happened with the lease for the laundromat on Cutler Street, that those old buildings truly had reached the point where they needed to be reorganized, and that she hoped the woman had found somewhere else to go. Rafe didn't answer, and it was in that silence, the same silence he had always used to make other people speak, that Constance Ledford was the one who opened her mouth again and said something she shouldn't have been able to know. She said she hoped he had fully recovered, that a stormy night like that must have felt very long, lying 3 floors up without a doctor, and that she had heard the woman had been forced to make do with whatever she had in the apartment. Rafe Belandi sat perfectly still. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in the garden. He stood, thanked her for the tea, and said he would remember that afternoon. He walked out to the car, sat behind the wheel, and remained there for a long time without starting the engine. That night, there had been 3 people inside the 3rd-floor apartment and 1 person down in the courtyard, and not one of them had told anyone. So how did this woman know he had been lying on the 3rd floor? That question followed Rafe Belandi all the way back to the harbor and stayed with him for several days. But the first thing he did wasn't try to find the answer to it. The first thing he did was tell his people to dig up every record connected to the hearing in the room with the cameras at St. Bridget Hospital. He wanted the transcript. He wanted the original forms. He wanted the form with the 3 handwritten lines that no one had been willing to read aloud. They brought him back a thick stack, faded copies, stamped pages, missing pages, and he sat in the office above warehouse number 9 for 2 nights straight, with that stack beneath the desk lamp, reading every line the way he read shipping ledgers. And the farther he went, the more the feeling in his chest began to resemble something he had known for a very long time. The certainty that somewhere there was a sheet of paper that had been pulled from the file before the file ever reached his hands. Late on the second night, when he pushed the stack aside and opened the drawer to look for another pen, his hand touched the stiff corner of an envelope. He pulled it out. It was ivory, thick, with the hospital's name printed in the upper left corner, and it had turned a duller shade with the passage of time, the way paper changes color when it has been left in darkness too long. The seal was still intact. Rafe Belandi sat for a very long time with it in his hands. He had sat at the head of tables in rooms where 15 grown men didn't dare clear their throats. He had signed papers that forced 40 households to move before the holiday season, without even bothering to look at the list. And there he sat, in the cold room above the harbor, staring at the sealed edge of an envelope, unable to open it. 4 years. It had lain in that drawer for 4 years, followed him through 2 office moves, through 3 winters, and every time he opened the drawer, his hand had automatically gone around it, the way a person avoids a sore place in a tooth without realizing he is doing it. Then he opened it. He tore along the edge with his thumb, slowly, and pulled out the papers inside. Medical records. The patient's name was Gio Belandi, 19 years old. He started at the beginning. He read the time of admission, the condition on arrival, what had been done, what there hadn't been time to do. He read the emergency department notes, and then he read the notes from the night shift. And there he found something he hadn't known in all 4 years since, because he had never asked anyone, because asking meant having to hear the answer. He had always believed his younger brother had been alone. He had lived with that thought the way a man lives with a piece of metal lodged inside his body. That the 19-year-old boy had gone down a brightly lit hallway among busy strangers with no one beside him, and that it had been Rafe's fault because he had sent someone who never came. But the record said that a nurse on the night shift had stayed. It said that she had remained after turning over her shift, not as part of her duty, not because she had been assigned to. It said that she had stayed until the end, and on the final signature line, at the very bottom of the page, the line that by regulation had to be signed by the last person present, there was a signature written in beautiful handwriting, the handwriting of someone who wrote so beautifully that he had already seen it taped to 2 broken dryers in a ground-floor laundromat on Cutler Street, on the pieces of paper that said, "Don't use. Maeve Donnelly." Rafe Belandi set the page down on the desk. He didn't stand. He didn't make a sound. He sat there beneath the desk lamp with both hands resting on either side of the paper, and inside his mind, very slowly, like water rising through a basement before anyone can plug the leak, everything began fitting itself together. He remembered the stormy night, remembered the voice beside his ear when he couldn't tell where the ceiling ended and the water began. For months, he had carried that voice inside him as though it belonged to him alone. He had believed, with something almost childish and desperate, that those words had been meant for him, that of everything life had ever given him, they were the one thing someone had given without asking to have it back. And now, sitting before that medical record, he understood that they hadn't been meant for him. They hadn't been meant for anyone in particular. They were simply the only words that woman knew how to say. They were words she had spoken hundreds of times, in hundreds of rooms, to hundreds of people who were leaving this world with no one beside them, because she was the kind of person who stayed in the places everyone else walked past. And one of those hundreds had been a 19-year-old boy named Belandi. She had spoken those words into his brother's ear first, 4 years earlier, in a hallway where Rafe hadn't been. Then she had spoken them again into his ear, and she hadn't known. She would never know, because to her, the name Gio Belandi was only one among hundreds that had passed through her hands in those years. One final signature line at the end of a night shift, one face she had forgotten long ago. That was what finally broke Rafe Belandi. Not the discovery that his brother hadn't died alone. It was the discovery that the person who had stayed with him, the person Rafe would owe for the rest of his life, was the same woman this entire city had called by that filthy name for 3 years, the same woman he had passed every Tuesday night through season after season, without ever once looking closely enough. He sat in the cold room above the harbor until the desk lamp cast a small golden circle over the page, and the sky outside began turning the color of lead. Then he folded the medical record carefully along its old creases and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He didn't tell her. Not that night, and not for many weeks afterward. There are some debts people don't dare speak aloud, because speaking them means forcing the other person to accept them, and that woman had already told him that she wouldn't. The story began on an evening so ordinary that, years later, no one could remember what they had eaten that night. Maeve was wiping down the shelf above the sink, rearranging the empty medicine bottles she used for safety pins and buttons, and she picked up one from the outermost row, gave it a gentle shake, and told Otis, who was sitting at the table, that she still didn't know what to do with it. Otis asked what it was. She said it was the thing she'd taken out of Rafe that night, that she'd put it away out of professional habit, and then completely forgotten about it, that she thought she should probably throw it away, but somehow it didn't feel right. The kitchen went completely silent. Otis Brannock set down his teacup very slowly. Rafe stood up from his chair and walked over to the sink, and he took the little bottle from her hand, turning it beneath the light, looking at the small, misshapen object inside the cloudy plastic. And for one very brief moment, Maeve saw something on his face she had never seen before. Surprise. He didn't explain anything. He only asked whether she would mind if he kept it. She said no. 3 days later, his people brought him the answer. The object wasn't something that could be bought at any store in the state. It belonged to a specialized shipment, a small quantity brought in by sea the previous autumn, and the entire shipment had passed through exactly one delivery at Pier Number 7. That delivery had complete paperwork. It had an approval signature, and that signature belonged to Wendell Rourke. Rafe Belandi held the document in his hand and said nothing for a very long time. Wendell Rourke was his attorney. Wendell Rourke had sat at his right hand in the windowless room beneath the harbor on the morning when 15 men stood up and control of the old harbor changed hands. Wendell Rourke was the man who had drafted every contract, every transfer of ownership, every agreement for 10 straight years, and the only man besides Otis who knew everything Rafe knew. And Wendell Rourke was also the man who had been sitting beside him that morning in warehouse number 9, when a cold paper cup of coffee slid across the metal table and stopped in front of a man named Hollis. Wendell had been one of the 3 men who looked down at his own hands that day. Wendell knew exactly what had happened to the man who received that coffee cup, knew more than anyone else still alive, because he was the one who had handled the paperwork afterward. So when Otis asked why it was him, why now, when he already had everything a man in this line of work could possibly have, Rafe Belandi sat down on the edge of the table and told him something he hadn't said to anyone in 4 years. Not even to him. He said that on the night his younger brother lay in the hospital, after everything was over, he had stood in the hallway and made a promise beside that bed. He said he had promised that he would dismantle the whole thing, not abandon it, not hand it over to someone else, but take it apart, one piece at a time, until there was nothing left that could ever make a 19-year-old boy have to walk into a place like that again. And he said that for 4 years, that was exactly what he had done. One union at a time had been moved into legitimate, documented operations. One shipping route at a time had been cut and replaced with real transportation contracts. One person at a time had been brought out of places with no way back, given a job with a name on paper, given time, given a way out. He worked slowly, quietly, the way someone dismantles a building without wanting it to collapse on the people still inside. Otis Brannock sat in silence and listened to all of it. Then he said, his voice roughened, that he had thought he knew who he was working for. And Rafe said that was exactly the point, because the 40 households forced out of the waterfront block hadn't been moved out, so the land could be sold. That block sat directly on the route Rafe needed to cut, and he had signed the paper without daring to look at the list of names, because he knew perfectly well that some people would have to pay the price for his attempt to set things right, and he hadn't been brave enough to look them in the face. Because there were people in that organization who didn't want to be brought into the light. There were people who had lived in darkness for so long that light itself had become a sentence. And the person who understood most clearly what Rafe was doing, the person who read every line of every contract, the person who saw before Rafe did the day when everything would have to be entered into public records, was the very lawyer who had sat at his right hand for 10 years. Then the final piece fell into place on its own, and it fell cold. On that stormy night, Otis had made 9 calls, 9 men who owed Rafe Belandi their lives, and not one of them answered. For months, Otis had thought it was because they were cowards. Now he understood that it wasn't. They hadn't answered because the news had already reached them. before Rafe ever collapsed in that alley, before Otis had even finished dialing the first number. The news said it was over, that Belandi was gone, that anyone with sense should stay where they were. Only one person could have released that message that early, and that person would have had to know in advance that it was about to happen. Otis Brannock sat there for a very long time before he could finally say it aloud. He said that throughout that entire night, while he had walked across the city looking for his boss, a car had been parked 2 blocks from that alley and had never started its engine, and Rafe said yes. He was sitting inside it, and he was waiting for the news. Rafe Belandi gave Wendell Rourke exactly one chance, and he gave it the way he always gave such chances, without warning and without explanation. He called him to the office above warehouse number 9 on a gray afternoon, told Otis to wait outside, and when Wendell walked in with a briefcase tucked beneath his arm, and the smile of a man who had been wearing that same smile for 10 years, Rafe placed exactly 2 things on the desk: the approval form for the delivery at Pier number 7, bearing Wendell's signature, and the small plastic medicine bottle with the object inside. He didn't say a word. Wendell Rourke looked at the 2 things. He set his briefcase down on the chair, sat, adjusted his cuff, and began to speak. He said he had signed that delivery as part of the usual procedure, that he signed dozens of such papers every month and couldn't possibly remember them all, that if someone had used his signature for something it had been done to him as well, that he was willing to work with Rafe to find whoever was behind it. He spoke smoothly, clearly, with evidence to support his claims, even slipping in a light joke halfway through to ease the tension, and he talked for nearly 10 minutes. Rafe listened to every word without interrupting him even once. Then he picked up the bottle, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, stood, and told him that was all, thanked him, and opened the door. Wendell Rourke walked out of that room still believing he had escaped. The following afternoon, Rafe Belandi sat in his office with the desk phone and a sheet of paper carrying 7 names, and he made his calls. The first went to the bank holding all of Wendell's loans, and Rafe only had to mention that certain documents concerning the collateral were about to be reviewed again. The second went to the owner of the building, where the law office rented its space. The third went to his 3 largest clients. The fourth went to the state's bar licensing board, and Rafe didn't lie about a single word in that call. He simply provided exactly what he had, in exactly the right order, and let the numbers speak for themselves. Otis didn't hear the 5th, 6th, or 7th calls, because by then he had already left the room. Within a single afternoon, the lawyer who had sat at Rafe Belandi's right hand for 10 years had nothing left. No office, no license, no client willing to answer his calls. No one touched him. They simply left him standing there, in a city that suddenly had nowhere left for him to sit. Maeve Donnelly was in the outer office for the final 2 calls. She had come to bring over some insurance papers, and she listened from beginning to end. She heard his voice, that calm voice, a voice that never rose even 1 notch. The voice he used to speak about a human being in exactly the same manner people spoke about a shipment that needed to be moved before dark. When he set the phone down and looked up, she was standing in the doorway, and in those 2 seconds he saw something on her face that had never been there before, and he recognized it immediately, because he had seen it on the faces of so many people throughout his life, only never on hers. She was afraid of him. She placed the folder on the desk and said she was going home. He called her name. She said she understood what he had done, that she understood all of it, and that she didn't defend him in the slightest. Then she said what made her cold wasn't what he'd done to him, but that he'd done it without his pulse quickening even once. And she knew because she'd taken his pulse enough times to remember it. Then she left. Rafe Belandi remained alone in the room with the 7 names on the desk, and for the first time in his life, victory tasted like something that had been broken. 3 nights later, everything broke apart in the tunnel beneath the harbor. Wendell Rourke had nothing left to lose, and a man with nothing left to lose no longer needed to be careful. It happened very quickly, in the concrete tunnel running beneath Pier number 2, where there was only 1 lane and yellow lights mounted at regular intervals along the ceiling. There was the scream of tires. There was the sound of something striking the side of the car twice, dry and sharp. There was the sound of breaking glass. Then the other vehicle reversed and disappeared around the turn, and everything ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of their own engine and the smell of smoke trapped in the enclosed air. Otis Brannock hit the gas. Maeve was in the back seat, and she had already pulled off her scarf before she had even fully thought about it, folded it in 4, and pressed with all her strength against the place on Rafe that needed pressure. The car shot beneath one tunnel light after another, and the yellow glow swept across his face in a steady rhythm. Light, dark, light, dark, like a clock counting down and no one wanting to hear it. She shouted at Otis not to stop and not to take the turn toward the crowded part of town. She pressed harder. Rafe's hand found her wrist and closed around it, and he said in a broken voice that she shouldn't, that she'd already lost her license once because of a man who didn't deserve it, that he didn't deserve it either, that she should take him to the hospital and let go home, and no one could blame her, and that he couldn't bear the thought of her losing it a second time because of him. That was all he managed to say. Maeve Donnelly bent close to his face beneath the flickering yellow light and told him he didn't get to decide this, that this was her choice, and that if he still had enough strength to bargain, he still had enough strength to lie still. Then she switched hands, pressed harder, and didn't let go for a single second for the rest of the way through that tunnel. The paper arrived on a Thursday morning, brought all the way to the door by a mail carrier wearing a blue windbreaker who required a signature, and Maeve Donnelly signed for it, then stood right there in the third-floor hallway and opened it, because there are some envelopes you know in advance shouldn't be carried inside your home. Petition to modify child custody. The petitioner was Brant Kessler. 3 years earlier, he had walked out of her life exactly 3 weeks after the hearing in the room with the cameras, taking 2 suitcases with him and leaving a note on the kitchen table while their 3-year-old child slept in the other room. Since then, he had sent money for the first few months and then stopped. Hadn't called on birthdays, hadn't called during the holidays. Now he was back with a steady job in the neighboring state, a home address with a yard, a lawyer, and a photograph. The photograph was clipped into the file like a piece of evidence, taken from across the street, slightly blurred, showing a woman stepping out of a black car in front of number 7 Cutler Street. The reason stated in the petition was written in the language every lawyer used, saying that the mother was currently living in an environment unsuitable for raising a child, that certain relationships placed the child at risk, that it was in the best interest of the child. Those 3 lines were all it took. Maeve read them a second time, then a third, and in her mind everything became cruelly clear. There was nothing to argue. It didn't matter what he had done for her. It didn't matter that he had never once asked for anything in return. It didn't matter that the boy loved him. That photograph, placed before a judge beside the name Belandi, would be enough. Maeve had learned a long time ago that this world didn't judge by the truth. It judged by what looked like the truth. She folded the petition closed, put it in the bottom drawer, and didn't say a word to her son. The boy came home from school that day, told her about how his class was going to build a model of the solar system, finished his bowl of soup, then sat down to draw. He didn't know there was a piece of paper in the house. He would never know. The following afternoon, Maeve went to the building on Ambler Street, not for her shift, and told Rafe Belandi that she was quitting. He asked why. She said she couldn't come there anymore, that she couldn't sit at any dinner table with him anymore, that from now on, if they happened to meet on the street, it would be best if they simply walked straight past each other. He asked whether it was because of what had happened that afternoon in the office, because of those calls. She said it wasn't. He asked whether it was because of the tunnel. She said it wasn't that either. He stood there waiting, and she looked directly at him and said she wasn't going to explain, that he should let her go and not try to find out why, and that this was the first thing she'd ever asked him for, and it would also be the last. Rafe Belandi had sat in rooms where people were forced to tell the truth simply because he remained silent long enough. He stood completely still for a very long time then. She said nothing more. Then she left. And the pain of it wasn't that she was leaving because she believed herself unworthy, because this time it had nothing to do with that at all. She was leaving because she had weighed exactly 2 things, very calmly, between one man and one child. And in that calculation, there was nothing to deliberate over. That night, Otis Brannick came alone to the 3rd-floor apartment. He brought nothing with him. He stood in the kitchen doorway as he had that first time, his hat in his hands, then pulled out a chair and sat down, and Maeve poured him a cup of tea that he never drank. He sat there for a long time before he spoke. Then he said there was something he had hidden for 4 years, and he wanted to tell her before she left the neighborhood. He said that on the night his employer's younger brother had been brought to the hospital, he had been the one sent there. He was the only one available. He was closest. He had a car. And he had sat in that hospital parking lot. He said he had sat there looking at the bright glass doors and had never gone inside. He said he hadn't gone in because he was afraid. Not afraid of anyone, but afraid of having to look. He had carried that boy in his arms when he was just learning to walk, had taught him how to tie his shoes, and he hadn't had the courage to walk through those glass doors and look at him one last time. He said he had sat in the car until someone came out to tell him it was over. Then he had driven back, and he had never told anyone, and for 4 years there hadn't been a single night when he went to sleep without thinking that the boy had lain there alone, without even one familiar person beside him, simply because he had been a coward. The 63-year-old man sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders shaking, and lifted both hands to cover his face, those large, calloused hands that had once broken other men's noses when he was young. Maeve Donnelly sat down in the chair across from him. She reached across the table and placed her hands over his. Then she said, very softly, that he should listen to her, that in places like that there was always someone who stayed, that she knew that for certain because she had done that very thing for 10 years, and that the boy hadn't gone alone. Otis Brannock looked up at her. He didn't understand why she said it with such certainty. He would remember her voice that day for the rest of his life, and it would be a very long time before he understood. And when he finally did, he would have to sit down again. The Harbor Light Gala was held every year in Warehouse No. 2, the only warehouse in the Harbor District that had managed to preserve its original wooden roof trusses, and every holiday season hundreds of tiny lights were hung overhead so that 300 elegantly dressed people could walk beneath them and feel, for one evening at least, that this city was still a decent place. The Ledford Foundation organized it. The Ledford Foundation presented the awards, and each year, the brass plaque bearing the recipient's name was placed on a small, dark velvet-covered podium at the head of the room. Maeve Donnelly was there because the catering company hired temporary staff and paid by the shift, and she needed every shift she could get. She wore a white shirt, a black apron, her hair tied neatly back, and she worked like everyone else, moving between the rows of white-covered tables with a tray in her hands, pouring water, clearing plates, never looking up. It had been more than a month since she had left the building on Ambler Street. She didn't know Rafe Belandi was in the room, sitting at the last table on the right, the most hidden place in the entire warehouse. The program went exactly as it did every year. Speeches, thanks to the sponsors, a piece of music, and then Constance Ledford walked up to the podium. She wore ivory, a single strand of pearls, and she spoke about community, about trust, about how a city could only remain strong when every person knew where they stood. Her voice was always soft, and that night it was softer than usual, the kind of gentleness that those who had worked with her had already learned to fear. Then she said she wanted permission to share something that had troubled her for several weeks. She said there were things happening right here in this neighborhood that, if left unspoken, would make her guilty as well. She said she had learned that someone who had once had a professional license revoked by the state medical board had continued, after the revocation, to use medical instruments and perform a procedure on a human body inside a private apartment, without registration and without reporting it. She paused for exactly 1 beat. Then she said she wasn't naming anyone, that she only wanted to remind everyone that under the law of this state, that wasn't a mistake. It was a criminal offense, and that she trusted the proper authorities would do their work. 300 people sat in silence. Somewhere in the warehouse, a fork touched a plate, then stopped, and everyone knew who she was talking about, because that person was standing in the middle of the second aisle, tray in hand, white shirt, black apron, beneath the rows of tiny lights. People turned to look, not all at once, but one after another, the back rows first and then the front, the way a crowd turns its head when it already knows which direction it is supposed to face. Maeve Donnelly stood there holding the tray. She didn't panic. She simply lowered it onto the nearest table, placed it down carefully, because other people's belongings shouldn't have to pay for one's anger, and she was about to turn toward the kitchen door. And at that exact moment, at the far end of the room, came the scrape of a chair being pushed back across the wooden floor. Rafe Belandi stood up. The entire warehouse fell silent, not because people were afraid, but because everyone in this city knew that this man didn't speak, had never spoken, and when he stood in a room with 300 people, it meant something was about to happen that no one could predict. He stepped away from the table. He walked forward along the right aisle, slowly, and 300 faces followed him. No one breathed. Constance Ledford remained standing on the podium and never took her eyes off him. Then Maeve Donnelly stepped across the aisle, blocked his path, and placed her hand on his arm. She told him, just loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, to sit down. Rafe stopped. The two of them looked at each other for exactly 2 seconds, and within those 2 seconds, something passed between them that the 300 people in the room couldn't read, and he stepped back once, then sat down in the empty chair at the head of the neighboring table. He didn't say a word. Maeve Donnelly took off her apron, folded it, laid it over the back of a chair, and walked up to the podium herself. She didn't take the microphone. Constance had stepped back one pace, and Maeve moved into that space, both hands resting on the edge of the podium, and spoke in the slow, clear voice of someone accustomed to reading a chart aloud to a room full of people. She said, "Mrs. Ledford was right, completely right, not one word wrong. She said her license had been revoked, and that on that stormy night she had taken medical instruments into her own apartment, without registration, without reporting it, and that under the law of this state, that was a criminal offense." Then she said the part no one in the room expected. She said she had known that from the moment she opened her medical kit. She said she had stood there with the case already open beneath the lamp, and had calculated it very clearly, that if she picked up that needle, she would forever lose even the right to ask for her license back, lose any possibility of ever standing in a hospital room again, lose the profession she had trained 10 years to practice, the only thing she still knew how to do properly. She said she had stood there and waited exactly once, the rest of her life against a man who would not make it through that night if no one did something. Then she said she had picked it up. She said that if that night came back a second time, she would still pick it up, and that if they had to take her to court because of it, she was willing to stand before that court, but she would not stand there and apologize to 300 people for the one thing she had done during those 3 years that she wasn't ashamed of. She finished speaking. She didn't look at Constance Ledford even once, and in the thick silence that followed, in the middle of the warehouse, Rafe Belandi stood up for the second time. He still said nothing. He only raised his hands, unclasped his cufflinks, then opened the top 3 buttons of his shirt, pulled the shirt free from his waistband, and lifted it. Then he slowly turned in a full circle, letting all 300 people in that warehouse see the line of stitches running along his side. 17 stitches, evenly spaced, straight as a drawn line. Rafe Belandi let the front of his shirt fall and fastened each button again, one at a time, without hurrying. And throughout those moments, not one of the 300 people beneath the rows of tiny lights could say a word. Then, from the 4th table on the left, came the quiet scrape of another chair moving back, and an older woman in a black coat stood up. She didn't walk to the podium. She simply remained where she was, one hand gripping the back of the chair for support, and spoke in the voice of someone who had practiced these words silently for many nights, without ever saying them aloud. She said her name was Rosalind Pike. She said her husband had died on the operating table at St. Bridget Hospital 3 years earlier, and that perhaps this room had read her name in the newspapers back then. Then she said the part she had come there to say. She said that for 3 years she had hated the wrong person. She said it once, slowly, and didn't explain another word, didn't recount what had happened in that operating room, didn't name anyone else, because she didn't need to. She only said that she was the person in that room with the greatest right to be angry, that if anyone in the world had earned the right to be angry, it was her, and that she wanted to make it clear, in front of everyone, that she wasn't angry at the woman who had just stood on the podium, had never had any reason to be angry with her, and that it had taken her 3 years to understand that. When she finished, she sat down. She didn't cry. She simply placed both hands on her lap and looked straight ahead. Of the 300 people sitting inside that warehouse, perhaps fewer than 20 truly understood everything those words meant. But all 300 understood something much simpler, that the woman who had lost her husband had just stood up to defend the woman who had been accused. And in the life of a community there was no evidence heavier than that. And at the first table, directly beneath the podium, a man in his 40s had been sitting in silence since the beginning of the evening. Peter Ledford had sat through his mother's entire speech, through the moment 300 heads had turned toward the woman carrying a tray in the second aisle, through the moment the shirt had been lifted. His left hand was still hidden beneath the edge of the table, exactly as it had been out of habit for 3 years. When Rosalind Pike sat down, he stood up. He didn't say anything. He simply rose, knocked over the glass in front of him, and walked toward the door, moving faster and faster. And by the time he reached the middle of the warehouse, he was almost running, a man in formal clothes running between white-covered tables beneath hundreds of tiny lights. And the warehouse's iron door slammed shut behind him with a sound that echoed all the way up into the roof trusses. No one followed him. No one needed to. Some confessions don't require a single word. Constance Ledford remained standing beside the podium. She didn't look toward the door. She looked down at the 300 faces turned toward her, and in that moment, She did something she had never once done throughout her carefully guarded life. She gave voice to the silence. She said, and for the first time that evening her voice was no longer soft, that everyone needed to come to their senses, that this was a woman who washed other people's clothes for a living on the ground floor of an old building, a woman her own husband had abandoned, a woman with no license, no profession, nothing at all. And was this city really going to let a woman like that teach it a lesson about morality? The words fell into the warehouse and remained there. No one answered. No one objected. No one shouted. No one stood up and pointed at her. They simply turned away one after another. The people nearest the podium looked back down at their plates. The people in the middle of the room leaned toward one another and began talking about something else. At the back of the room, someone started eating again, and the scattered sound of knives and forks began to rise, then grew louder, until it became the ordinary sound of a dinner continuing. The band looked at one another, then resumed the song they had left unfinished. And Constance Ledford stood there, on the dark velvet-covered podium, bearing her family's foundation name, dressed in ivory, wearing a single strand of pearls, surrounded by 300 people she had ruled through the sound of her voice for all those years, and not one of them was looking at her anymore. That was the punishment. There was no sentence, no mocking applause, no accusation, not a word. Only a room full of people turning their backs on her at once and returning to their meals, leaving her standing there presiding over something that no longer existed. Later, when people in the harbor told the story of that night, they didn't talk about the shirt being lifted, and they didn't talk about the woman in black who had stood up. They said that on that night, in warehouse number 2, Constance Ledford had spoken a sentence, and the entire city had refused to answer. 3 nights after the gala, Rafe Belandi went to pier number 7 alone. He told Otis to stay home, and when the old man started to argue, Rafe only looked at him once, and Otis stopped. He drove his own car, brought no one with him, and walked the entire length of the weathered wooden pier to the old waiting shed where 4 men were waiting for him. Those 4 men had stood behind him for years, and 3 of them had once sat around the metal table in the windowless room on the morning he took control of the harbor. He didn't sit down. He placed a stack of papers on the damp wooden table and said he was giving everything back. Pier number 2, number 4, number 7, the warehouses, including warehouse number 9, the contracts still in force, the routes, the connections, everything. No negotiation, no part held back. One of the 4 men asked what he wanted in return. Rafe said he wanted exactly one thing in exchange: the name Maeve Donnelly and the name of her son erased from every ledger, every mention, every conversation, forever, and that from this night forward no one in this line of work was ever to know that those 2 people had existed. Someone laughed. The man asked whether he was serious, whether he really intended to sell an entire harbor district just to buy peace for a woman who washed clothes for a living. Rafe Belandi looked at him and said he was selling something he had stolen to buy something someone had once given him for free. Then he pushed the papers across the table, turned his back, and walked the entire length of the pier against the sea wind. That same week, his people brought back one final thing. It was a copy of a wire transfer, dated not long before, the amount not especially large, but enough to change the life of someone who was struggling, deposited into Brant Kessler's account in the neighboring state. The company listed as the sender was a small consulting firm, and that small consulting firm received its entire operating budget from one organization, the one called Ledford. The man had never truly wanted his son back. He had been paid to file the petition. He had accepted money to play the part of a father who wanted his child, just long enough for a photograph taken from across the street to have a place before a judge. When Otis Brannock reached that line, he set the paper down and sat in silence for a very long time, then said that in all his years around this harbor he had seen every kind of filth, but he had never seen anything dirtier than that. Then it was Rosalind Pike's turn. She didn't need anyone's help. She went to Peter Ledford's house herself one morning, carrying exactly one thing in her handbag: a photograph of her husband taken in their backyard, the old man wearing a cloth cap, garden shears in his hand. She placed it on the table in front of him and said that he owed 2 people in this world a name. One of them was no longer alive to receive it, and the other was still living in the harbor district and was having whatever remained of her life taken away from her. She said he could repay only one of the 2, and then she left. 3 days later, Peter Ledford went to the state medical board headquarters by himself, without a lawyer and without an appointment, and he confessed. He spoke for nearly 4 hours, confessing that his hand had been trembling, confessing that there had been 3 verbal warnings during that operation, and where those 3 warnings had disappeared, confessing who had decided that someone had to be given a name to carry the blame. The statement was recorded, typed, and signed. After that, everything collapsed quickly. The way structures built on weak foundations still collapse. Constance Ledford lost her seat on the board of St. Bridget Hospital within 9 days. The Ledford Foundation was subjected to a full review of its expenditures over the years, and the small consulting firm was the first line anyone questioned. No one arrested her. They didn't need to. They simply stopped inviting her. And Rafe Belandi paid his price, and he paid it in full. He turned himself in under a plea agreement that he personally instructed his new attorney to draft toward the harshest terms the law allowed. He confessed to what he had to confess and protected what concerned other people. And because of that, his sentence wasn't reduced by even a little. Every asset in his name was seized, including the building on Ambler Street. He had already completed the paperwork transferring the 3 old waterfront blocks into a community trust before everything began, and that was the one thing they couldn't take from him, because by then it no longer belonged to him. He received years of probation, was barred from leaving the state, required to report regularly, and permanently prohibited from owning or registering any business connected to the seaport. The morning he walked out of the county courthouse, the air was cold and clear, and there was no black car waiting at the curb. The man who had once sat at the head of the metal table while 15 other men didn't dare clear their throats walked down the steps carrying a canvas bag, a lease for a 2-room apartment on the north side of the harbor, a used car he had bought from a welder, and a name that, from that day forward, no one would have to lower their voice to say. The Cutler ferry made its first run before the sky had fully brightened, and that morning the fog lay so thick over the water that the people standing at the end of the pier couldn't see the second buoy, only hear its bell striking at regular intervals somewhere out there. Maeve Donnelly stood in the waiting area with her son beside her, 2 tickets to Newport bought the day before, and the faded brown cloth suitcase at her feet. She had decided to leave the week before, when the letter from the state medical board arrived saying her case had been reopened, but would have to wait until the season was over before there could be another review, and when she sat down and calculated everything she had, the number was only enough for a beginning somewhere cheaper. Toby was half asleep, his head resting against his mother's arm, his blue-framed glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. The long, deep whistle of a cargo ship drifted across the harbor, and the sound disappeared into the fog instead of echoing back. She bent down and pulled the suitcase closer, and it rolled smoothly over the wet concrete on all 4 wheels, and once again she remembered that morning early in the week when she had sat down, tipped it onto its side, and looked at the new wheel secured by 2 tightly tightened screws. She had never found out who had done it. Then there were footsteps on the pier. Rafe Belandi came toward them through the fog, alone, without a car, without anyone following him, wearing the old black wool coat that looked much more worn than the last time she had seen it. About 10 steps away, Otis Brannock stopped and didn't come any closer, his hat in his hands, and behind him came a 3-legged dog hobbling along, one ear torn, its tail wagging as though it had just discovered an entire city. Rafe stopped in front of the waiting area. He didn't offer money. He didn't say anything about the stormy night, didn't say anything about the warehouses, didn't say anything about everything that had happened over the past few months, because there was a 6-year-old boy sitting right there. He simply held out 2 sheets of paper. The first was a copy of the records he had submitted to the state medical board, with his real signature, his real address, and even the signature of a man under probation who knew perfectly well that every line on those pages could turn around and cut into him. The second was the document transferring the 3 waterfront blocks into a community trust, with the transferor's name clearly stated, the beneficiaries listed as the residents of Cutler's Point, and at the bottom, in the final notes, a short sentence saying that the 2nd floor of the middle building was to be preserved as a place where free medical care could be provided. Maeve took the 2 papers and read them for a long time. Fog gathered in beads along the edges of the pages. The ship's whistle sounded again, closer this time. Then she looked up and asked him why now, why he hadn't given her these things earlier. Rafe said it was because, before, he still had something to give, and as long as he had something to give, she'd never believe he wasn't buying something from her. He said that now he had nothing left, and this was the first time he could stand in front of her with empty hands. Then he asked her the old question, the one he had asked the first time while lying on the couch beneath the picture of the whale, the one he had asked again when he stood in the empty laundromat where none of the machines were running anymore. He asked what she wanted from him. The ferry was backing toward the dock, its engine rumbling through the fog, and the people ahead of them began lifting their luggage. Toby woke, pushed his glasses back up his nose, saw the dog, smiled, then slipped his small hand into his mother's. Domino came running over, spun once, and dropped himself right on top of the faded brown suitcase, exactly like a dog confiscating a decision. And Maeve Donnelly, the woman who had spent her whole life with a packed suitcase beside the door, the woman who had spent her whole life knowing only one skill, leaving before she could be left behind, stood there in the fog and heard her own voice answer, and she was surprised because it didn't tremble at all. She said one word. She said, "You," after an entire season had passed. When the sea wind in Cutler's Point had finally stopped cutting into people's faces and the red brick walls began warming again beneath the sunlight, there was a new sheet of paper attached to the refrigerator door in the third-floor apartment at number 7 Cutler Street, held in place by the same lemon-shaped magnet. It was a copy of Maeve Donnelly's professional license, the date of issue still new, the ink still sharp, and it was mounted beside the crayon drawing of a blue whale with a smiling mouth. Those two things remained side by side on the refrigerator door for many years afterward, and anyone who entered that kitchen saw them first. On the second floor of the middle building, among the 3 waterfront blocks, where apartment number 12 and the adjoining units were, the boards covering the windows had been removed, the walls whitewashed, tables and chairs brought in, and an evening clinic had opened there to provide free care for the people of the neighborhood. A small wooden sign hung outside the door, carved with the name of a 19-year-old boy, and not many people in the neighborhood knew who that boy had been. They only knew that when evening came, the door opened. Sitting at the reception desk was a 63-year-old man with close-cropped silver hair, writing each person's name into the ledger in large, slow handwriting, and not once did he leave before the last patient had been seen. Evenings in the third-floor apartment remained much as they had always been. Rafe Belandi still cleaned his plate, not leaving a single grain behind, and Maeve still served him a little more without anyone ever saying a word about it. Toby still patiently taught him how to fold a napkin into a boat, and to this day, he still hadn't managed to fold a single one properly. And the boy had accepted that some adults simply learned slowly. The 3-legged dog slept beneath the table, and in the third-floor hallway, the small, weak yellow light was still left on, the same light that had burned through that stormy night long ago, except now, it wasn't burning to keep a fever at bay. It was burning to wait for someone to come home for dinner. Some nights he came home late, stopped at the doorway, and said she didn't need to leave the light on, and she answered that she knew, and that was all. This story leaves behind something very simple, that true power isn't about making other people fear you, but about giving a name back to someone who had been robbed of it. Life will sometimes judge us wrong, sometimes slam 4 doors shut in our faces, one after another, but kindness never truly disappears. It only takes the long way around and comes back to find us at exactly the moment we need it most. And sometimes, the person who saves an entire human life is the very person who chose to stop in the place where everyone else had simply walked past. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can continue bringing you more beautiful stories to listen to every day. What did you think about Maeve and Rafe's story? And who was the person who opened a door for you when you were going through the hardest time in your life? Leave a few lines in the comments below. We truly want to hear what you feel deep in your heart. Wishing you and your family good health always, and days filled with happiness and peace. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.